Good afternoon. I'll call this meeting of the Reopen South Carolina Select Committee to order. We appreciate all the members being present with us and staff, and we have various members of Accelerate SC with us here today, as well as we'll be hearing later on from our Superintendent of Education, Ms. Molly Spearman, who is also in the audience with us today. We'll be hearing from her, but we're delighted, and I've personally have observed a lot of the work that Accelerate South Carolina has been doing, and I appreciate all of y'all's commitment and all your members. But we're certainly delighted this afternoon to hear from the chairman first, and on our agenda, Mr. James Burns. So I'll turn it over to you, and then I know that we also have Mayor Knox White, chairman of the Governor Subcommittee, Accelerate, and then our colleague, former colleague, kind of still colleague, and friend, Senator Greg Ryberg, who has been the chair, or continues to be the chair of the Resource Subcommittee that's with us today, too. So, but Mr. Chairman, Chairman Burns, we appreciate your being here, making yourself available, and look forward to hearing from y'all.
Mr. Chairman and Senators, thanks. Should I keep the microphone on, or do I? I do.
You're
I
good,
should.
please.
Okay.
Yeah.
I've got used to these microphones these days. First, I joked, and when I talked to Ms. Cassidy the other day, I said, look, we come as three, not as three individuals, because this has been a collaborative team that the governor put together. And as you noted, Mr. Chairman, we've got 30 folks from various parts of the state, various industries that have come together and have considered a number of issues. At the outset, I should let you know that tomorrow is when I will present the proposed final report to our full Accelerate SC membership. And I want to thank President Peeler for including, I know 3 of the members from this committee are also working with us, and so we appreciate them being there. But we're presenting it tomorrow, and there may be, I want to put the caveat out there that this is not finalized yet.
This is a working draft.
Draft 1 was finished last night at about 10:45 in my office. So I just wanted to hit on a couple of high points, and then I'm sure y'all have some questions. First off, we broke up our Accelerate SC into 4 components. We've got the response component. They were looked to identify challenges regarding workforce capacity, industry issues, regulatory issues, supply chain and logistics issues. We had a number of folks who served from Accelerate SC who served on that component. The Department of Commerce and PRT were our coordinating state agencies. And I think important in what we've learned and what you'll see, the Chamber of Commerce, along with the Department of Commerce, did a survey of businesses and throughout the state, large, small, various sizes. And I think some of the data from that is important and has really been part and parcel of helping to drive our discussions and some of the decision-making along the way. I will tell you one of the big challenges at the outset was how can we safely, and the governor's challenge us was how can we safely, incrementally lift limitations on businesses that were in place because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so we've come up with a really good process, I think, to be able to look at those guidelines, propose those guidelines, safety protocols so that businesses can reopen and move forward. There's not a specific time frame on, hey, right now we're at 50% capacity in restaurants. When are we going to go to 75%? One thing we've done is the science. Following the science has been one of our big predictors of how we've moved forward, and I think it's the smart way to move forward because that's how you can do it safely. So we addressed a number of guidelines. I'm sure you've seen as the governor's issued executive orders where we've lifted some of those limitations on businesses. And frankly, the ones that are left are more what I would call large congregate type gatherings. And so that's one of the things where, if you want to encourage practicing social distancing, and you've got to really be creative to think how you can do that for, say, a concert venue. Right, and so those are continuing to be worked through by our folks on the response component. I'll tell you probably the biggest issue that these folks talked about and that I'll raise for you is liability concerns. And I have, in talking to, anecdotally, I'll give you a story about there's a business, it was a hair salon that had reopened, and they had this page-and-a-half document that they wanted their customers to sign as if, as some type of limitation of liability. Now, for all my friends who are attorneys on the on this panel, know that that's a good assumption of risk defense, possibly, but that doesn't solve the liability question. In talking with Senators Graham and Scott, obviously there's some discussion in Washington about possibility of some limitation of liability, but it's something that's come up numerous times. And one of the biggest things that businesses, especially small businesses, are concerned about. And so one of our recommendations that you're going to hear is about liability protections for businesses. There's various components to it. I know I believe there's some proposed legislation. I believe Senator Davis is chairing a subcommittee on that issue. But it's something that is a real concern, and that I think this body and the folks in the House should very, very, very strongly consider. Because we're not talking, it's not the concern of the very large.
Yes, sir.
Let me ask my friend James a question. And I've been talking about this issue.
Senator from Darling.
I've been talking about this issue for a long time and don't want to spend a lot of time on it. And he's been involved in this process for a while. Help me understand how that. I read all the stuff and I've been involved and been on the committee. You've done a great job with it. Help me, how do they expect the General Assembly to pass legislation in a session now that has not been called back, that will get called back, that will deal with financial issues on the COVID-19, and then maybe get called back in the budget? Help me see how we would do that quickly, and then how would it be able to pass both bodies, 3 readings during this particular time, and when would it stop? So they said it needed for a temporary period of time. So we keep saying it, but now we're going to get to the nuts and bolts while we're here. Senator Davis is going to chair a committee afterwards. But let's get to the point as to exactly what is being asked, because I can tell them now is that there is a small window of opportunity, and I think that you're gonna have to make it narrow as to what they're asking for. And I haven't read all the legislation and stuff yet, but just because we're doing this for the committee, I want you to see how we would do it, and then we'll move on later. You and I can have this conversation because it won't happen today, but.
I understand.
Since we're putting it out there.
I thought, yes, sir. And I guess when you ask, like, how can the Senate and the House do it? When when I started off on this process, I was trying to figure out what am I going to do to help, drive the discussions to revitalize the economy of South Carolina in a safe way. I had no idea how I was going to figure out how to do 5 meetings, how I was going to do 11 component meetings, multiple conference calls, put my law practice on the side to be able to do it. But we worked through it, and through the help of a lot of 30 folks who worked with us, we were able to work our way through it. So I'm probably not the best person to say like how y'all should do things. You've been doing this for a while, but I think it's a fair discussion to have, Senator Malloy, and I think it's a debate that should be had. But again, I don't want to get in front of Senator Davis's subcommittee.
I think that the question though becomes is that if we're going to get called back by the Senate and the House, and by the President Peeler and Speaker Lucas, and we're going to end up dealing with the issues in the CR, and then we have they normally call us back for 6 days, and then so what we're talking about is that how do you pass something in 6 days, and what effect, how long it will be had. And I don't want to belabor the point because we got a lot of people to end up hearing from. Yeah. But then we have to make certain that it fits within the sine die.
And that'll be up for us to kind of figure out. But
just very quickly, Mr. Chairman,
Buford, yes.
Just very quickly, because I know we're going to have a subcommittee on this, and I don't want to waste the time. But I think, to your point, Senator Malloy, Senator from Darlington, is that for something to be passed. And I do think it has to be passed in June. We're talking about something that's immediate in terms of need. I mean, having something passed later this year isn't going to help us, because what we're talking about right now are, for instance, I've got POA associations who've called me who won't open up their community pools and their gyms because their liability insurance won't cover it. And so I think to answer the Senator from Darlington's question is, whatever we pass is going to have to, first of all, be very limited in duration and sunset by a very specific date, so that we recognize that it's something that's episodic. I think it's going to have on the front end certain safety protocols and best practices that an entity or a business would have to ascribe to in order to avail themselves of the safe harbor. And I think we're just going to have to be very realistic about it, because, as you say, probably whatever comes out of our subcommittee, I would imagine, would have to be reduced to a bill that's read across the desk that maybe gets assigned to judiciary, unless it's taken up by unanimous consent. So by definition, it's going to have to be something that I think all the stakeholders come together on. As a practical matter, I don't think, and I'll just make this general observation and then stop, I don't think that if we draft this the way that I've described, that the trial bar should have too many concerns about this, because they would have a tremendous burden in terms of causation anyway to successfully prosecute a negligence suit when you're talking about somebody saying they've contracted the virus in a particular location. So I do think that there's room here if we all approach it in good faith. But to answer your question, and Senator from Darlington's question, there's going to have to be a consensus bill, because we do not have time, like we typically would do, maybe file a bill in a 2-year session, rally your troops, muscle it through subcommittee, have write-ins, whatever. It's going to have to be something that's consensual in nature, is my observation.
And
So the answer, Mr. Chair.
yes, sir.
So the answer is that the expectation, if something happens, it will be happening during the 2 weeks that we speculate that we may come back.
I think that's the only utility it has,
that's my question.
is if it passes then, because you're trying to encourage businesses to reopen, and by November, the utility of legislation like that, I think, goes away.
That's right. And I think, Mr. Chairman,
Yes, sir,
and
please.
to respond to Senator Malloy, I think there's somewhat of a crisis of confidence right now with some of our businesses. And I think to the extent that we can remove the limitations that's causing that crisis, that to the extent that your body in the House can do that, our recommendation is to the governor is that be done. But I won't belabor the point. I'll move along to.
But I think what I heard you say was a lot of time was spent within your Accelerate SC in dealing with that issue as a.
Oh yes, sir. It came up virtually. It came up virtually every meeting. I think Senator Malloy and I talked about it
But I think that-
multiple times every
Mr. Chair,
every meeting.
and I want to address that quickly, though, because we're dealing with the people in the room. And so the folks in the room is I mean, I'm in the room, but it's business. And so that's very fair. But what I want to make certain that we don't forget is that, the main issue for me in this whole process is access to medical care, and how do we repair our citizens back, not just business. And so the conversation has to be twofold. And so what we have now is that the senator from Greenville was talking about is how many people were on the unemployment rolls, and basically there's an issue there, and we'll get to that point. But also, I just think when we approach all of this is first out of the box on liability, and that's why it sort of it made me rise up. And I got 56% of the people that's dying are African American here in our state, and with 27% population. And so I just want to make certain that there's some sensitivity that we end up having, because we want to get business back too. But there's a part of the community that is not in that room that says, if we're going back to work, the frontline people are the essential employees, and it is coming back to our households, and that's who's dying. It's not necessarily that those individuals are there; they're there and they're bringing it home. And so, I support Accelerate. I support my good friend here, but we got bigger issues than the liability issues that we can end up addressing, and that was just the first one out of the box. That's why I have to address. I'm sorry.
Well, no, I was just going in order, Mr. Chairman, of
Yes,
our
sir.
components. So
Make that one last.
we've had some Senator Malloy and I have had some spirited discussions.
All right, that's
Our
interesting.
second component was the protection component, and this was coordinated by DHEC, along with a number of the members of the healthcare community. Kind of the big takeaways here that were addressed, and Senator Malloy touched on one of those, was issues of our testing and contact tracing. And I think that you've seen more recently, one of the challenges was to test 2% of the population over the next 2 months. And I think DHEC and their partners are meeting, they're meeting those benchmarks. One of the other things that I think you will see is that with respect to a state testing plan, and I know that this body and their continuing resolution and the General Assembly's continuing resolution, that there was an acknowledgement of continued work on a state testing plan. I think that if you go and look at the Accelerate SC website, we are giving information to people to let them know where testing sites are. I will tell you, this is my observation, and I think some other members of Accelerate SC's observation. A testing plan is not where somebody DHEC gets a call and says, hey, come to my place and do a test on this day, and come to my place and do a test on this day. That's not a testing plan. That is, so I would encourage that. I think we've seen the collaboration between folks, between the healthcare entities on being able to increase the testing and the availability of testing. On the contact tracing front, we were at about 130 before the governor appointed us with Accelerate SC. One of his challenges was how can we do better? How can we help try to fight back and go on the offensive against the disease? Now, one of the challenges was to have 1,000 contact tracers before June 1st. I will tell you, I think we're at 1,400. An additional 2,000 have expressed interest. One thing that I think I should point out about the contact tracing, because I think there's a lot of misconceptions about what it is. It's an ombudsman-style program.
Right. And we actually heard from DHEC
Okay.
and MUSC last week. So I think unless there are specific questions by members of the committee, and to your point, those were very important for us to understand how that worked. from that
Yes, sir.
standpoint. Yep.
Yes, sir. Okay. And so those were kind of the big issues within protection. And then PPE, how do we get PPE for our communities? How do we get them for people? How do we get them for the state? One of the recommendations I think you'll see is the creation of a state stockpile of PPE, a 28-day state stockpile similar to what you're seeing with on a national level. Based on some discussions we had, we thought that was a prudent thing to do because, everybody was fighting for the same PPE. Probably one of the great things that has happened as far as collaboration is the Chuck Spangler and the group that's doing basically the PPE collaborative, where businesses can come and see the availability of PPE and matching businesses up. That's been a really good impact. We also had our governance component, and I won't take Mayor White's thunder on that. I'll let him discuss it. And then finally on our resources, and there's a couple of issues I want to point out, and of course I'll turn it over to Senator Ryberg. We'll probably both tag team this piece. One of the things is that we've worked very hard with is understanding what the CARES Act says, what is acceptable, what is a necessary expenditure that can be reimbursed, what's the allowable reimbursements. I cannot understate the importance that a professional grants manager company doing that is necessary. I'll just be candid with you, there are lots of pots of money out there, and you want to avoid duplication because there are clawback provisions in the CARES Act. And so I think you really, that professional grants manager is a very, very important component to the resources piece, and something we've talked about a lot. I do want to touch on, we've been able to get some data from state agencies, higher ed and technical colleges, counties and special purpose districts and municipalities regarding expenditures to date and expected expenditures. Again, those have not been validated yet. That's why that grants manager is very important to validate those. We've also identified some initiatives, some enterprise initiatives that we think are that we're recommending to the governor where there's funding eligible. I'd like to point out a couple of those briefly that we've talked about that have garnered a lot of importance. The first is the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund. And we're going to make a very significant recommendation to the governor on that because, again, we have seen that, helping businesses helps their employees. It helps them to not have to furlough or reduce their workforce. We have the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund, and one thing we talk about every day, there's over 420,000 people. One of my challenges to our group was I want to put Dan Elsie out of business, right? That's our goal.
We all want to do that.
Yes, sir. Let's put him out. And I know it's touched on every one of y'all's communities. And so that was something very important that we addressed. The other thing that we've talked about that's been talked about a lot has been broadband. We could, you could set up a separate committee just for that, and we could talk about that for a couple of years. But I think we've identified some ways that we can address some short-term issues in our recommendations. And then there's some longer-term things to be addressed. Finally, I'd like to touch on the piece about education, because I'm going to look. I have the benefit of kind of being a free agent, and so my constituency is one which is to advise the governor. But everything that we've looked at, we've approached in a way of how can we validate that this is an expenditure that can be reimbursed, and applying critical analysis before we would make a recommendation to the governor to be recommended to y'all for an appropriation of funds. And so we looked at initially based on a request from Superintendent Spearman, starting school 5 days early. Initially, her request was 6 days. I asked, well, isn't the school week 5 days? And so it went from 192,000 to 192 million, from 192 million to 160 million. And she agreed with that assessment that, hey, it's a 5-day school week, and that kind of makes sense. We talked about the availability of meals for our students. For some of our children that are in need, there was no question in our mind that that's something we recommended with respect to the USDA program. That was about $12 million. And then finally, summer reading camps and recovery programs, and that's one we've discussed a lot. The initial recommendation we got was for $115 million. We didn't see that there was a lot of structure to that, and so we went back to the superintendent and said, hey, we're not inclined to support this. We did put an amount on the line. This week we got back something from her that a recommendation that is now $51 million. And so that request, in all candor, I'm trying to figure out how we went from 115 to 51, but we're trying to achieve the same concept. The biggest thing we looked at in that $47 million, and Senator Ryberg will talk about this, is what are we doing to help the kids? If I'm hearing about we've got to, get this administrator or this person or this adult or that, how are we helping the kids? And I would ask you to ask that question of yourself when you're thinking about how you appropriate the money and what is being done to help those children. So our recommendation that we're going to move forward tomorrow with is for $47 million. And we believe that amount addresses issues that specifically touch children and impact children. And for them to be able to get an assessment on the front end, on the back end, to have face-to-face, to the extent we can, instruction with them to help move them along. There's no doubt that there are some of our children are in crisis. Okay, one of the things that scared me, and I told Superintendent Spearman this when she said that there's about 6 to 7% of our kids we haven't heard from. I want you to think about that for a minute. And that to me was, hey, look, whatever we need to do to help move along these children, we should do that. But like any appropriation, there should be guidance, recommendations, a plan. I mean, we just, you know, in the interest of wanting to make sure that you are good stewards of resources, I think you should apply some scrutiny to those requests. As I said, we're going to report this out. I'll report this to our full Accelerate SC committee tomorrow. And then we know that there's going to be some, you know, there may be some things that change with respect to our recommendations on the resource component. That's probably the biggest one that could change. So to the extent that you want to, you know, put a bullseye on, if you want to put a bullseye on anybody, put it on me. Because the 30 members that have sat there for 5 weeks and have done this work have done a great job. So, you know, if somebody needs to take the cannon fodder, I'm there.
Well, we're in this together, so we appreciate the work that y'all have done and the way y'all have gone about doing that
Mr.
work.
Chairman,
Yes, sir. The Senator from
real
Greenville.
quick, I just wanted to say thank you for everything you've done. It's it was kind of, before I even knew I was going to serve on the advisory side, somebody asked me what I thought about the Accelerate SC committee. And I said, well, there's a lot of chiefs on there. It'll be interesting to see how that works out. And the amazing thing is you did a great job herding a bunch of chiefs. And I thought everybody kind of left their ego at the door, and you did a great job. But thank you.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you. Any other questions of the chairman? Not. Great presentation for us. And we'll move forward with the mayor then at this point. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, for being here and for your continued
Mr.
leadership.
Chairman, I
on this standpoint.
appreciate it. I stand by to assist as necessary. Thank you.
Sounds great. And as the mayor comes forward, I do want to acknowledge, I know that the chairman had mentioned the three, and we've done it in previous meetings, but I think it's appropriate to still do that today as well. The three members that the president of the Senate appointed to the Accelerate South Carolina was the senator from Darlington, Senator Malloy, the senator from Beaufort, Senator Davis, and the senator from Greenville, Senator Turner. So we do appreciate y'all's faithful attendance and involvement in this. And Mayor, delighted to have you with us today, and thank you for making time for us today as well.
Yeah, my pleasure, my honor. But Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you for letting me address. I too want to say thanks to Mr. Burns for his heroic service. I can attest that he works at 11:30 at night and 2 in the morning, and odd times like that because he sends us emails. So the next morning, I'm saying he was still up that time of night. So he's really working hard with all the different facets and all. The subcommittee or the committee of governance was formed of a number of good people from local government, education, and law enforcement. So that's the three groups we were kind of collating and putting together some ideas for. I believe you've got a copy of some of the working papers with some specific recommendations. Yeah, I won't spend a whole lot of time on every one of them by any means, but because you've got them there. But just some words up front. We had some good discussion early about the dilemma that's faced here as well as the whole country, which is brought to mind even before restaurants began to open. Had some really interesting conversations with owners of restaurants who weren't so much talking about when the restaurants are going to open, because I always expected that to be the first question, when's it going to happen? That really didn't come up too often. What came up again and again was, when we do open, how are we going to get people to come back into the restaurant again? And I thought that was real surprising and interesting that they were thinking ahead and they had that observation. Because that really is what it's been about all along for a long time, and that kind of touches on what we spend a lot of talking about. And the word is confidence, confidence of the consumer who walks into the shop or store, confidence of all of us to go in a restaurant, and what it would take to rebuild that confidence. And that's been the biggest thing I think everyone's going to wrestle with. There's an article in the Wall Street Journal, by the way, today about U.S. consumer confidence being at a real low, as you might imagine, and how scary that is, because after all, in the United States, the consumer confidence is what drives the economy. So this is a big issue, not just for us, but all around the country. But in terms of building confidence, he touched on a couple of things that I think are still fundamental, and we talked about in our committee a lot. One is the testing program, and that's come a long way from the very first meetings we had to where we are now, and I salute DHEC and the governor and everyone who's been pushing that. But to have a credible testing program. Some folks told me, again, back home in the restaurant scene, they really wanted to come have the day where when they're employees are brought in, they take their temperature and that kind of thing. When there's a problem, they want to be able to actually send that person almost immediately to be tested if there's an issue, something that convenient that it not be down at the hospital, but it be perhaps even the downtown area. So the testing is hugely important, I think, in terms of rebuilding confidence. So it has lots of different impacts. Obviously, it's sort of an early warning system should we get into a recurrence. That's how we're going to know we're in a recurrent situation, is by having a robust testing system. But it's part of the overall picture of confidence. Good recommendations in this report from other study committees about building up the protective equipment, making sure it's all warehoused for the future, and why that's important to a lot of different industries. Well, not just local governments, but also perhaps industry. Somebody even mentioned in one committee, nonprofits need to know that too. I mean, just a lot of people touch on that. It'd be nice to know if we had the vital equipment on hand in the future. So that's important too. And then finally on confidence, we talked about this in the committee, and then back home in Greenville, we had a lot of discussions in similar vein with the Chamber of Commerce. So what can we do to build confidence, and could we perhaps somehow certify restaurants and certify retailers that they're following the proper protocol? And part of that, and you can't get away from this too, is, what is the protocol? And there are a lot of cooks in the kitchen on this. Some are doing better than others. I think if you're in the restaurant industry in South Carolina, you're in a good way, because the South Carolina Restaurant Association has done a good job. It's not just something they thought of. They comb the whole country for best practices. And they've done a good job generally getting the word out to restaurants, whether it's big, small, everything in between. This is the protocol in South Carolina for restaurants, sort of tried and true from ideas around the country. So that's been good. Oddly enough, I think where I've run into a problem has been more on the retail side. Not the big retailers. If you're a Home Depot, you probably get pretty good directions from your home office and the like. But if you're a small retailer, and most of them are, we found they had no clue. And we're really searching on the internet themselves and trying to get ideas. We've sent Prisma people out into our community to try to give them some help, some confidence building that this is the way you might want to operate your store. So the need for the protocol being out is very important. So all of that led to discussion about how we could address that, as well as just kind of certify people. So I want to show you what we've done. Presented this to the committee, and Bob, can you hold that poster? So we put this together in Greenville and just kind of offered as a good practice anywhere, really, to provide some ability to do this. So we have what's called the Greenville Pledge, and it works like this. It's sponsored, by the way, by Greenville County, the City Chamber of Commerce. And basically, if you're a business, a retailer, or if you're a restaurant, you go on the website. It's a great website. It breaks it into this is the protocol. And if you can live with that protocol, if you like that protocol, understand it, you sign the pledge online. And if you do that, you also get to feature this in your window at your store, so people walking by can see that this restaurant has taken the Greenville Pledge, or this retailer. And you can also note, if we do a good job, who hasn't signed the Greenville Pledge, which we hope will be telling. What we're also finding, this is what I think is interesting. We do these things, you never quite know what's really going to happen on the ground, is that it gets back to the retailers and the restaurants. It's been helpful for them to understand, okay, these are kind of the minimum requirements protocol. Some of them you expect, sanitize frequently, and there's some rules about that. Promote social distancing, and that's the tape on the ground and all that kind of thing that they're accustomed to. Everybody has limitation capacities to deal with under the state law now, state provisions. Monitoring employee health. The employees wearing face covering. Sometimes that's an issue for the employees as well as what you hear in the news about everybody else, but for employees, they have to agree to all that, and they do, and then they can post this in the window. Again, early signs are good, but it's also been interesting to see the reaction on the public. We are now beginning to have just enough of this to see that some have it, some do not, and what do people think about that? We also think this is part of the continuing education of those who are in the businesses, that these are important things they have to do. That you can never say this stuff enough. It's got to be repeated. And for the public, same thing. When you have one of these in your window, you're being held accountable, because people aren't too shy about saying, well, wait a minute, you didn't. We've already had some emails about a certain place that took the pledge and they spotted somebody without a face mask, so there you go. But seriously, it just reaffirms the need for, at least for social distancing in particular, again and again, for everybody. So that's been so all of that's to say that's part of building an atmosphere of confidence for all of us to make this thing work again and to get consumer confidence back to where it needs to be, which is a huge issue. Very briefly on some of the recommendations, on the local government side, because I'm a little more comfortable on talking about that than the other, we consulted and we really turned this over to a good free-form discussion with the Association of Counties, Special Purpose Districts, and the State Municipal Association. So we, in very quick order, surveyed as many people as we could, mayors, council, elected officials, county council, in terms of what their needs are, what the problems are. And we came up with some list of some things that were highlighted. Just very briefly, and I'll just touch on a few. Local governments do not have continuing resolutions, and the fiscal years end in July. That was not a big issue in my city because we were kind of down the road on our budget, but for a lot of cities it was. So the idea was that if cities had a chance to have something like a delay, if you will, on adopting their budgets instead of what's required currently in states. I think out of 271 cities, 204 have fiscal years ending July 1. So you see what the problem is there. Some of the cities said they had no idea how to do a budget this year. Of course, you could just roll over last year's, I suppose, but even that's not a good practice. There's a provision in here about front-loading the local government fund. That's a good one. There's only one payment coming up anyway. The first thing local governments did around the state was to do what they could to help small businesses. And that meant delaying the payment of some taxes and fees, business licenses. So that meant we're all carrying this, and we need some cushion. This is something everybody had in common, because everybody jumped in there to do something to be helpful in some way or another, by waiving a fee or whatever they could. So any kind of additional funds to be injected that would provide some cushion so local governments can continue to carry this load perhaps a little bit further would be helpful. There's some talk about the state revolving funds, again, delaying payments because that would provide an opportunity to hold on to the money a little bit longer. That's kind of those are the major components of those provisions. In higher education, and education side, I'll let the superintendent address K through 12, which I know you heard many of the same ideas you heard from James. But on the higher education side, on state education, K through 12, I do want to say one thing is because it's kind of quasi-government. We received information that there are 17 school districts that require a petition in order for a person to be on the ballot. That's a problem, obviously. So we kind of dug that out of this process to have that waived during this period. That's a good one. Higher education, it was all about flexibility.
And we did adopt that. And
you did?
pass that. Yes,
Fantastic.
that was
Okay,
passed
good.
when we came back for the budget.
Moved over to the House.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a good one, yeah. Whether they want to keep that long term is a good idea too. Higher education was all one word: flexibility, 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 mainly in HR policies, furloughs, annual sick leave policies, anything they could do in terms of flexibility of moving people around, furloughing people, things like that.
The majority of those were done, I think, as well.
Many of them were
in
in
the
the CR
continuing
also.
resolution.
Yeah, I believe you're correct, yes. I see that, and thank you for that.
But it's good to have that consistency. So
It was, they dug out a lot of these kind of HR type issues early on. Ability to move money around between accounts came up again and again with higher education. The Lottery Technology Fund, to use some of those funds for operational needs instead of just capital during this time, came up. And let's see, and technical colleges had a number of things that, again, some of them which were taken care of already by the legislature, but I do want to note that they really must have technology needs that have been there a long time, because that came up as absolutely the greatest need, which was improving their technology infrastructure in technical schools. Didn't hear as much of that from the higher education in general. You heard a lot about it on the technical school level. So something was going on there. On first responders, very interested in the personal protection equipment issue, mental health programs for first responders, And then for the governor's office, it was first responders who were trying to decipher what those executive orders actually said, what the level of enforcement was supposed to be, and they were pretty blunt about saying that many times they read about the newspaper, weren't informed, that kind of thing. Also, the first responders appreciated the testing that the state is undertaking, as well as hospitals, but oftentimes when a couple hundreds of people show up for testing, local law enforcement in some cases didn't know it was taking place, so they had issues of traffic control and that kind of thing. So anyway, lots of good practical things, many of which, as you mentioned, have already been addressed, which we appreciate, but good practical things to kind of keep the boat afloat during this time, and hopefully, more importantly, to help small business and help the consumers and all of us regain our confidence. So thank you.
Well, and thank you. And I think your closing comments there, it gets back to that confidence. It's that confidence of the consumers, our citizens, and the businesses as well. So y'all have done a great job of working through that, and then also with local governments as well. Are there questions for the mayor?
Yeah, appreciate it.
From that standpoint?
Yeah, thank you.
But we'll look forward to continuing to see that success. And I really like your pledge that you did, and I've been following that over there. Then I think that I wish you great success with that from the pledge for your businesses and being well received by the consumers, and I'm sure it will continue to be a work in progress from that standpoint.
Yeah, and if I can just make one final comment on that, Mr. Chairman,
Please.
I really appreciate that in terms of the pledge and everything else. I'm telling you, you all know this is true. As things open up, we all get kind of careless in our ways again. I know I certainly do too. And I think we're all going to be faced, and certainly local government level, with how to remind people again and again and again. And at this point, we're not talking about things that we're not closing businesses. We're not talking about things that are onerous. It's just developing some good habits and the social distancing. I think the pledge is part of that because it's a constant reminder in a shop in a store. It reminds you again what's going on. But beyond that, it's going to increasingly be an issue of just how to remind people, especially when we have large gatherings and such, that this is still important, that the public health emergency is not over with, and they need to do their part. So we'll be looking for some good creative ways to address that too.
Sounds great. Well, thank you.
Okay,
Appreciate
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
thank
Mr.
you
Chair.
for your work on the Accelerate SC, but also as mayor of Greenville. Yes, sir. The senator
Chair,
from Durham.
I think we're just having a sidebar conversation. I thought we passed that issue with the school board petition, and wasn't it in this? Wasn't it in the CR?
We passed it, but it's over in the House.
Okay.
Okay, and so we'll move right along here with our agenda, and that brings us to the subcommittee, the chairman of the Resource Subcommittee of Accelerate South Carolina, the former senator from Aiken, and remodeler of the unemployment system for the state of South Carolina, and other things dealing with commerce. So we appreciate you answering the call from the governor to chair this subcommittee, but more importantly, for being here with us today to hear your report and comments.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate it. In 2012, when I sat on that side, I'll tell you, it was easier to be shooting darts at this guy than it is to be standing here right now. But I want to tell you that the governor picked an excellent group of people. And Senator Turner, I think you said it right. I think most of the people, I think 99.99%, like Ivory Snow, checked their ego at the door. And actually, they checked their location and where they came from at the door. And the discussions we had were statewide. They weren't